By the time Europe learned to make porcelain, something else had already changed. It was no longer just a technical problem that had been solved. What had changed was Europe's way of seeing China and China's place in the world. This is the story of how that shift happened. In the mid-17th century, China went through the transition from the Ming to the Qing. War disrupted both the production order in Jingdezhen and the export trade. The supply of porcelain from China became unstable, just as European interest in Chinese porcelain had already been awakened. This gap first encouraged the export of Japanese porcelain from Arita and Amari. It also created space for European substitutes. Delft, in the Netherlands, became the most typical example. Local craftsmen still could not make true Chinese hard-paste porcelain. They could only use tin-glazed earthenware to approach its appearance. They covered the surface of the pottery with a white tin glaze and then painted it with blue decoration. The result was an object that looked close to blue and white porcelain. But Delftware did not have the hardness, density, whiteness, or slight translucency of Chinese porcelain. Its advantages lay elsewhere, in price and supply. Imported Chinese porcelain was limited in quantity and expensive. It mainly entered the hands of courts, nobles, and wealthy collectors. Delftware was an imitation, but it brought white and blue decoration, Chinese-style patterns, and the imagination of the East into a much wider range of urban homes. For many European consumers, it offered a lower-cost substitute for Chinese porcelain. The popularity of Delftware shows that a stable demand for the style of Chinese porcelain had already formed in the European market. But this imitation also revealed a technical boundary. European craftsmen could copy the visual effect of blue decoration on a white ground, yet they still could not make true hard-paste porcelain. To cross that boundary, the problem was no longer pattern or glaze. It was raw materials, the porcelain body, and high-temperature firing. But the technical gap was only part of the problem. Behind it was a deeper anxiety, one about money, dependency, and power. Since the 17th century, Europe had continued to buy Chinese porcelain, tea, and silk. It also consumed large quantities of Indian cotton cloth, Japanese lacquerware, and other Asian goods. These goods changed European life. Porcelain entered dining tables and cabinets. Teawares entered the rituals of receiving guests at home. Indian cotton cloth entered clothing and interior decoration. For consumers, they represented novelty, refinement, and fashion. But for European merchants, manufacturers, and political observers, these goods created another kind of unease. Europe wanted to buy Asian goods, but it was difficult to sell European goods into the Chinese market. Chinese merchants were far more willing to accept silver. As a result, the more Europe consumed Chinese porcelain, tea, and silk, the more it had to face the problem of silver flowing into Asia. To many mercantilist thinkers at the time, the outflow of gold and silver was not seen as ordinary consumption. It was the loss of national wealth. This anxiety was not directed at porcelain alone. After Indian cotton cloth entered Europe, it directly challenged local textile industries. Its colors were bright. Its price was reasonable. It was washable and durable. Both Britain and France once restricted the import and use of Indian printed cottons. Chinese and Japanese lacquerware were also highly admired. But Europe found it difficult to obtain the same lacquer materials and techniques, so local craftsmen had to produce substitutes with European varnishes and pigments. Porcelain followed the same logic. First came large-scale import, then came imitation of the appearance. Finally came attempts to break through the materials and firing technology. The more popular Asian goods became, the harder it was for Europe to treat them simply as beautiful imports. They proved something that made Europe uncomfortable. Some of the goods Europe desired most were not made in Europe. To obtain them, Europe had to pay in silver, or it had to admit its dependence on Asia in both technology and markets. The criticism of the British writer Daniel Defoe appeared in this context. He showed clear hostility toward Chinese goods and porcelain. He was also hostile to foreign luxuries in general. His main concern was not whether a porcelain bowl was beautiful, It was why the English were spending money on these imported goods at all. In his view, Chinese porcelain was nothing more than an object made from fired clay. Yet European consumers gave it an exaggerated value. In this broader debate, porcelain appeared alongside tea, silk, cotton cloth, and lacquerware as part of a foreign fashion that seemed to drain British wealth, put pressure on local manufacturing, and make household consumption more luxurious and excessive. This kind of criticism had influence because it touched a deep anxiety inside Europe. The more widely these goods spread, the more easily old boundaries of status were disturbed. Local manufacturers and craftsmen feared that foreign goods would take away their market. Moral critics feared that household consumption was losing restraint. Observers of political economy feared the continued outflow of silver. Porcelain therefore changed from a refined object into a troubling one. It was still bought, displayed, and used, but in the eyes of its critics, it no longer represented Chinese craftsmanship alone. It also stood for luxury, vanity, the outflow of silver, and dependence on foreign goods. But this trade anxiety did not make Europe stop consuming Asian goods. On the contrary, it made Europeans even more eager to move the production of these goods onto European soil. Delftware could imitate the appearance of porcelain, but it could not solve the problems of hard-paste porcelain, its materials, and its firing process. The real technical breakthrough still had to return to raw materials, the porcelain body, and high-temperature firing. The search for this technical breakthrough became even more urgent in Saxony in the early 18th century. Augustus II, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, was one of the most famous porcelain collectors in Europe. He bought large quantities of Chinese and Japanese porcelain and used them for display at court. In his court, porcelain was not an ordinary utensil. It was a luxury collection and also a display of royal prestige. The clearest example was an exchange he made with the King of Prussia. Augustus II once traded a regiment of Saxon dragoons for a set of blue and white porcelain vases from the Kangxi period. These vases later became known as the dragoon vases. This example shows that in European courts at the time, porcelain could already be connected with military resources, diplomatic relations, and royal honor. But collecting had an obvious limit. Chinese and Japanese porcelain had to enter Europe through long-distance maritime trade. Its price, quantity, and supply were not controlled by the Saxon court itself. As long as the technology remained in Asian hands, porcelain would still be an imported luxury. What Augustus II wanted was precisely this power of production. Under his support, the Saxon court began to organize porcelain experiments. The project brought together court funding, mineral resources, and experimental personnel, with Tschirnhaus playing a central role in the experimental search. Tschirnhaus had originally studied mathematics, optics, glass, and minerals. From the 1690s onward, he entered the service of Augustus II. During this period, he carried out a series of crucial experiments. He used large optical lenses to concentrate sunlight and produce the high temperatures needed to melt minerals. This research later became directly connected to porcelain making. The difficulty of hard-paste porcelain was not only the formula, it was also heat. European craftsmen could use tin-glazed earthenware to imitate the blue decoration on a white ground. But true hard-paste porcelain required a body that became hard and dense under high heat. If the temperature was too low, the body could not vitrify. If the temperature was too high or poorly controlled, the object could warp or crack. Tschirnhaus's work in optics and high-temperature experiments allowed him to understand porcelain from the point of view of material change. He was concerned with which minerals could withstand fire, which kinds of clay could keep their shape at high temperatures, and what kind of firing could make the body white, hard, and dense. The key breakthrough came from a white fire-resistant clay found locally in Saxony. This white clay could withstand high temperatures. After firing, it formed a relatively white and hard body, providing the crucial raw material for the production of European hard-paste porcelain. Around 1708, the Saxon experiments achieved a breakthrough. In 1710, Augustus II founded a porcelain manufactory at Meissen. Meissen became the first place in Europe to produce hard-paste porcelain successfully. But Meissen mainly served royal courts and elite collectors. Its production was also limited by royal monopoly and technical secrecy. More importantly, being able to make hard-paste porcelain in Europe did not mean that Europeans had fully understood all the conditions behind China's long-term, large-scale production and export of porcelain. What Europe had cracked was a technical process. What it had not yet understood was a system. China's long-term ability to export porcelain in large quantities did not depend on a single secret formula. It depended on the complete production system that had taken shape in Jingdezhen. This system included sources of raw material, clay preparation, shaping, glazing, painting, kiln loading, firing, and distribution. For a piece of porcelain to become a finished object, it had to pass through many stages. It also depended on the divided labor of large numbers of skilled workers. In the early 18th century, the French Jesuit François-Xavier d'Entrecolle observed porcelain production in Jingdezhen. He wrote what he saw into letters and sent them back to Europe. His most important writings on porcelain production in Jingdezhen were two letters from 1712 and 1722. These letters were later included in the Lettres édifiantes et curieuses and were also used in Du Halde's Description of the Chinese Empire. Texts of this kind also shaped how 18th century Europeans understood Chinese craftsmanship and Chinese civilization. What d'Entrecolle recorded was not a simple porcelain recipe. He described the use of porcelain stone and kaolin. He wrote about how the raw materials were crushed, washed, settled, and turned into clay suitable for forming porcelain bodies. He also described the fine division of labor in Jingdezhen. In his account, before a piece of porcelain entered the kiln for its first firing, it had already passed through the hands of about 20 workers. After the first firing, many more specialists took part in the later stages, including polishing, painting, and glazing. By the time the object was completed, it could have passed through the hands of dozens of workers. Only after these steps were completed would the object enter the kiln again for a second firing. Different workers handled different stages, and the whole production process depended on long accumulated experience and a stable division of labor. D'Entrecolle's account shows that Jingdezhen did not rely on one secret formula to sustain production. It was supported by a highly divided porcelain-making system, and in the early Qing period, this system had not stopped working. During the Kangxi reign, the imperial kilns at Jingdezhen gradually recovered. The wars of the late Ming and early Qing had damaged porcelain production in Jingdezhen. After the Qing court reorganized the imperial kilns, court orders, financial support, and technical demands once again entered Jingdezhen. Kangxi himself was interested in craftsmanship and Western knowledge. Jesuits such as Joachim Bouvet and others introduced him to Western geometry, astronomy, and surveying. At least at the level of court technology, Kangxi was not an emperor who completely rejected outside knowledge. The recovery of the imperial kilns meant that Jingdezhen was no longer only a place of commercial production. It once again became a technical center serving the imperial court. During the Kangxi reign, Jingdezhen produced large quantities of blue and white porcelain, wucai, doucai, and monochrome glazed wares. Kangxi blue and white porcelain was known for its bright color and rich tonal variation. Glazes such as Langyao red and peach bloom also showed the early Qing ability to control high-fired copper red glazes. These products show that Jingdezhen was not simply repeating Ming traditions. It continued to experiment under the pressure of court demand and the accumulated experience of craftsmen. During the Yongjing and early Qianlong periods, Tang Ying managed the imperial kilns at Jingdezhen and pushed court porcelain production into a more refined stage of administration. Tang Ying was not only an official in charge of the imperial kilns, he was also a specialist in ancient ceramics. He understood the needs of the court. He also dealt directly with production in Jingdezhen. During his time at the imperial kilns, he did more than supervise craftsmen and make sure they completed their tasks. He also took part in the management of glaze colors, vessel forms, and production procedures. During Tang Ying's tenure, Jing Dezhen was still able to experiment constantly with new glaze colors and decorative methods. Famille rose, painted enamels, antique-style glazes, and porcelains imitating bronze, lacquer, and jade all show that the Qing court did not merely ask Jing Dezhen to repeat traditional porcelain. It continued to make new aesthetic and technical demands. All of this shows that Chinese porcelain remained technically vibrant in the 18th century. If we look only through the lens of Europe's later contemptuous view of China, it is easy to assume that Chinese porcelain had already lost its creativity by the 18th century. But Jing Dezhen, from the Kangxi reign to the Yongzheng and Qianlong reigns, shows exactly the opposite. Chinese porcelain production was still innovating. It was just not innovating in the European industrial sense. Jing Dezhen could still produce porcelain that was complex, refined, and technically demanding. But this ability became harder and harder for Europe to understand as a sign of the future. In the context of Europe's industrial competition, it was more easily seen as an old system, highly mature but difficult to transform. The significance of d'Entrecolle, then, was not that he leaked a secret formula. After his letters entered Europe, Chinese porcelain was no longer only a distant finished object. It also became an object of study for European scholars interested in materials and firing. Réaumur was one example. After receiving porcelain clay samples sent by d'Entrecolle, he began to analyze the properties of this material. He tried to identify the main components of the porcelain clay samples. He also tried to explain, from the perspective of minerals and firing, why porcelain could become so hard and dense after firing. But Réaumur's research also shows that early 18th century European science was still limited by older ideas. Although he could study porcelain clay through experiment, he still believed that crystals could only form from aqueous solutions. Minerals, rocks, water, sedimentation, and the biblical story of the Great Flood could still be placed within the same framework of explanation. This helps explain why porcelain was so difficult to fully decode. The problem was not simply that Europeans did not know a certain recipe, nor was it that Chinese porcelain possessed some unspeakable mystery. The deeper difficulty lay in the fact that the knowledge system for understanding material change, mineral structure, and high-temperature firing was still taking shape. Porcelain research helped push that knowledge forward, but the researchers themselves were still constrained by older frameworks. So the impact of Chinese porcelain on Europe was not only that it offered a commodity that could be imitated, it also led Europeans into a series of new questions. What kind of clay could withstand high heat? What kinds of minerals could change the porcelain body? How did temperature affect the result of firing? And what exactly was the difference between pottery, glass, and porcelain? This was one of the ways Asian manufactured goods pushed Europe toward industrialization. Chinese porcelain, Indian cotton cloth, and Japanese lacquerware were not only consumed by Europe. They also forced European craftsmen, merchants, and scholars to face a reality. Many of the most popular goods, with the highest quality and the most stable markets, were not made in Europe. If Europe wanted to escape this dependence, it had to search for local materials, improve methods of production, and build its own manufacturing systems. Jing Dezhen offered an important point of reference. Long before steam-powered factories came to define industrial production, China already had a vast production city built around porcelain. There were specialized divisions of labor, professional trades, quality selection, market orders, and long-distance trade. When Europeans studied Chinese porcelain, they saw more than a product. They also saw a way of organizing production. In the mid to late 18th century, what Wedgwood achieved in Britain was precisely a breakthrough in the organization of ceramic production. He took the stimulus created by Asian manufactured goods and reorganized it within the industrial conditions of Britain. Staffordshire already had a tradition of pottery production. It also had coal, clay, and canals. In the mid to late 18th century, Britain's consumer market expanded. Tea, coffee, sugar, and table manners became more widespread, and demand for ceramic wares grew with them. Wedgwood was not facing only royal courts and elite collectors. He was facing a much broader market of urban households, merchant families, and middle-class consumers. This was different from Meissen. Meissen represented royal manufacture. It relied on court funding, technical secrecy, and monopoly operation. Its first customers were royal courts and elite collectors. Wedgwood was more like an early industrial entrepreneur. The problem he had to solve was not only whether he could produce objects that resembled Chinese porcelain, it was how to produce them steadily, how to standardize forms, how to control costs, and how to sell complete sets of wares to a much wider group of consumers. To solve these problems, he organized ceramic production in a way that came closer to the modern factory. Precise division of labor, apprentice training, foreman management, timed work, the employment of female workers, and demands for punctuality, cleanliness, and saving materials all pointed toward the same goal. The production process had to become controllable, repeatable, and expandable. He also used new technologies and new methods of selling: steam power, machine lathes, transfer printing, high-temperature thermometers, transport routes, market research, advertising, sales catalogs, showrooms, and celebrity endorsement were all brought into his business system. Wedgwood's advantage did not lie in one particular formula. It lay in the way he connected production, technology, management, and the market. He was not satisfied with the domestic market either. Wedgwood's products were sold in Britain, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Denmark, Russia, and even back into Asian markets. At first, Chinese porcelain had entered Europe in large quantities. Later, European ceramics began to return to Asia and compete there. This changed the rules of competition faced by Chinese porcelain. The division of labor in Jingdezhen still belonged to a highly mature handicraft system. It maintained its advantage through skilled craftsmen, kiln experience, court orders, and a production city formed over a long period of time. Wedgwood's ceramic production, by contrast, was moving toward the modern factory system, standardization, brand management, and long-distance sales. So what Chinese porcelain now faced was no longer just another kind of porcelain. It was a new system of production. For a long time, Chinese porcelain had been extremely strong in the pre-modern world. It relied on mature craftsmanship, huge productive capacity, skilled workers, and long experience in export trade. But by the late 18th century, the European ceramic industry had begun to organize production through factory management, technical experiment, brand marketing, and imperial trade networks. Jingdezhen could still produce porcelain that was complex, refined, and technically demanding. But Europe had already changed the standard by which it judged production. Wedgwood represented one European response: to turn the market demand stimulated by Asian goods into an industrial manufacturing system at home. As European manufacturing matured, the place of Chinese porcelain in European discourse also began to change. This change did not happen only in economics and technology. It was also projected into discussions of gender and taste. In European public opinion at the time, a gendered language about porcelain began to spread widely. Critics often linked porcelain with vanity, softness, and irrational household consumption. In their descriptions, those who were obsessed with collecting porcelain were often women or court nobles given over to pleasure and lacking a grand political vision. This rhetoric lowered porcelain's status. It was no longer treated only as a civilized symbol of the noble East. It was also described as a plaything that consumed attention and encouraged vanity. At the same time, European taste was going through a sharp turn. After the mid-18th century, as the Enlightenment deepened, neoclassicism began to rise. Neoclassicism emphasized reason, symmetry, simplicity, and the sense of order associated with the classical world. Under this new standard of taste, chinoiserie, once highly fashionable, and the Rococo decorative style closely connected with it, gradually came to be seen as excessive, strange, and lacking in reason. The rise of domestic manufacturing, gendered criticism, and the shift in aesthetic standards worked together. Chinese porcelain was no longer seen simply as proof of a refined East. Alongside this, Europe's utopian image of China quickly began to collapse. Europeans still consumed large quantities of Chinese goods, including tea and silk. But the way they explained China had clearly changed. China was no longer described mainly as a model empire of fine craftsmanship, complete order, and abundant goods. Instead, it was increasingly placed inside another narrative. It had mature handicrafts but lacked a mechanism for continuous technical renewal. It had a huge market and production system, but appeared closed, slow, and lacking in vitality. It had ancient institutions and aesthetic traditions, but was seen as unable to adapt to the new world of trade and industry. This change in historical mentality did not mean that Europe had looked down on China from the very beginning. It went through a longer process, from balance to hierarchy. From the late 17th century to the early 18th century, some European intellectuals still saw China as a civilization that could be seriously compared with Europe and even learned from. Leibniz was a typical example. In his view, China and Europe were not simply divided into the advanced and the backward. Each had its own strengths. Europe was strong in science, mathematics, and technical knowledge. China was strong in law, ethics, political governance, and social life. This was originally a theory of balance. Leibniz was not saying that China was more advanced than Europe, nor was he saying that Europe was more advanced than China. His view was closer to a kind of mutual complementarity between China and the West. Europe could learn from China in social order and moral governance. China could learn from Europe in mathematics, science, and technology. At least at this stage, China was still seen as a weighty civilization, one that could be compared with Europe. But by the late 18th century, especially with the expansion of European manufacturing and the rise of the British Industrial Revolution, this balanced view began to change in meaning. In later European philosophies of history and theories of civilization, the very qualities Leibniz had praised in China, its strength in ethics, law, and stability, were increasingly reinterpreted as a lack of historical change, a lack of drive toward progress, and a condition of stagnation. By the time of Herder, and especially Hegel, China was no longer simply a civilization that could be compared with Europe. It was increasingly placed inside Europe's own linear framework of history. In this new view of history, science and technology, industrial production, and global trade gradually became important measures of civilizational vitality. Europe was interpreted as the representative of the future, development, and historical progress. China, by contrast, was fixed in an ancient and static position. It appeared as an empire with a long past, but one that struggled to enter modernity. This also changed the symbolic meaning of porcelain. Chinese porcelain had once shocked Europeans because it was hard, white, refined, and difficult to imitate. Its immortality once seemed to represent superb craftsmanship and the stability of an ancient civilization. But after the late 18th century, that stability was increasingly rewritten in another language. It was no longer maturity, but stagnation. It was no longer endurance, but an inability to change. And once this language changed, the trade relationship changed with it. By the 19th century, this shift in language was further amplified by a new kind of trade power. As European manufacturing systems, such as Wedgwood's, matured, the technical authority of Chinese porcelain in European eyes clearly declined. Europe no longer saw Chinese porcelain as an irreplaceable miracle from the East. But trade anxiety did not disappear. British demand for Chinese tea continued to grow, while the Chinese market did not absorb British goods on the same scale. The problem of silver flowing out continued to trouble British merchants and the East India Company. For porcelain, Indian cotton cloth, and lacquerware, Europe could respond through imitation and domestic manufacturing. But for tea, and for the larger trade deficit with China, Britain turned to the colonial system in India. It exported opium into China and used illegal trade to turn the flow of silver in its favor. This is not the story of porcelain itself, but it is the continuation of the same trade anxiety. In the early period, Europe paid silver for Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea. Later, European manufacturers tried to reduce their dependence on Asian goods through domestic industry. Later still, trade imbalance began to be rewritten through colonial resources, illegal commerce, and military pressure. The Opium War of 1840 made this shift in power impossible to ignore. Europe's judgment of China no longer came only from porcelain, taste, and comparisons of craftsmanship. It was increasingly shaped by industrial capacity, maritime trade, colonial systems, and military power. So, the point of this history of porcelain is that Europe's way of explaining China changed. Chinese porcelain had once been a symbol of technology, wealth, and civilizational order. Later, it was placed inside a different narrative: trade imbalance, luxury consumption, feminine taste, outdated decoration, handicraft stagnation, and an Eastern empire that needed to be redefined by European industry and trade power. Porcelain itself had not become something else. What changed was the standard by which Europe judged it. And what changed too was Europe's position in world trade.